everyone. Nice buzz tonight, as Darlene pointed out. We've got some great speakers. I don't think you're going to be at all disappointed. We're going to have a great night. So this is our 31st double talk and our very first for 2018, so welcome. I'm Stephen Varady, Sydney-based architect, educator, writer and critic, and since 2015 I've been the curator and organiser of the Double Talk series for Brickworks. Double Talk is Brickworks' ongoing architecture speaker series, showcasing the best architects from around the country in all 6 Brickworks design studios in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Adelaide and Perth. Double Talk is about explaining and understanding the making of architecture. Double Talk is also about generosity and the sharing of knowledge across our design professions and across the country. Once again, we bring together 2 architects from outside of Perth to talk to you about their work. We ask them to give you some behind the scenes insights into their practice and their projects, about the brief, client, site, design process, construction process, and relationship to collaborators, as well as showcasing the completed works. Tonight we have Anita Panov from Sydney and Scott Baumforth from Hobart, who will show you some beautiful and diverse range of exceptional projects. We'll begin with Anita. Anita Panov was born in Wollongong and studied architecture at the University of Newcastle, along with a year of study under scholarship at Vrije Universiteit in Belgium, graduating with honours in 2001. Anita worked initially with Jackson Teese in Newcastle and then Sydney, before commencing with Smart Design Studio in 2004, where she was instrumental in the design and delivery of a number of significant projects and was appointed associate in 2008. Anita began Panov Scott with Andrew Scott in 2012, and they received the AIA Emerging Architect Prize in 2016. As co-director of Panov Scott, Anita pursues a rigorous study of typology, a design development approach informed by the input of various stakeholders, specialist consultants and manufacturers, as well as a meticulous attention to detail. In her presentation, you will see an extremely rigorous design approach related to context, use, materiality and detail. The precise execution and consideration of every detail found in the work is demonstrative of Anita's 17 years of experience in the design and delivery of highly crafted buildings. Most of the early built works of Panov Scott have been smaller scale residential projects, with the practice's first projects, Armature for Window, 3x2 House, Art Shed and Jack, being justifiably awarded at state and national level. If you look at the Panov Scott website, you will also find a selection of beautiful PDF publications that they prepare to explain each of their projects. Following this success, Panov Scott have more recently been engaged for some larger scale projects in which they continue their rigorous architectural pursuits. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Anita Panov.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you to Brickworks for the invitation to Perth to speak here tonight alongside Scott. Thank you also to Stephen for the introduction and for inviting me to share the work of our practice with you for this inspiring and thoughtfully curated talk series. And to you all for coming along to listen. So this is Panov Scott, our practice and family portrait in one. 4 of us during the day and 4 during the evening. Amidst our project work last year, various competitions and some travel, we invested time into the making of an exhibition. The focus was not our work, rather more about the way in which what we are doing might loosely belong within a local or collective idea about working at a certain scale, in a certain place, in the transformation of domestic spaces. A small exhibition, as it was named, proved to be enormously successful, not only with architects and architecture students, being hosted by the Tin Sheds Gallery of the University. I'm just going to try to moderate my distance. University of Sydney's School of Architecture, but also attracting a much broader audience over its 6-week duration. It seems an appropriate starting point within the format of the talk series, that is, using an event, which took place for a period some 5 hours to the east. What really struck us in curating this exhibition was an astounding ensemble of similarities, or rather universalities. Themes, perhaps, which were introduced by the participating architects in response to the questions we posed of them. And so, after describing the exhibition in more detail, I thought to use the themes in reverse to describe a number of projects completed by Panov Scott. When we initially met with the gallery, we laid out some printed cards containing precedents. Not having curated an exhibition before, we identified a few which we somehow aspired to match in the directness and legibility of their content and the beauty crafted in their display. And the first was Unfinished, the Spanish pavilion of the previous Architecture Biennale, along with the offering of the web-based catalogue. Zoe, who we were presenting to, said, "Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? You know, we've actually just secured an agreement to bring it to Australia. That's going to be our next exhibition." We thought, okay, at least we're on the same page. So the second precedent, Coincidences by John Wardle Architects. These beautiful easel-like frames as intricately crafted as any of the buildings displayed. "Yep," said Zoe, "so it looks like that will be the exhibition just after Unfinished. So the one just before yours." So we realised we had a few big acts to follow, and in the end we just had to get started. We invited 19 architects, ourselves making 20, to submit a single project for the exhibition, typically one that we had envisaged might sit well with our still developing manifesto. We were overawed by the generosity from those invited through all stages, but particularly an immediate willingness. Within 24 hours, we had affirmative and excited responses from all. You can see they're a varied bunch, from our youngest peers to some of our teachers and mentors. Work we admired. The requested material was honed to a consistent format, that being 2 drawings and 2 photographs. The black and white line drawings in plan and axonometric view, each drawing paired in display with a photograph, the pairs to be found opposite each other in the space. Just 4 A3 pages per project, printed on paper and pinned to the walls. The space itself was more difficult to settle. We'd agreed on the need that the exhibition be experiential and multi-sensory and evocative from inside and out. Tin Sheds has this huge display window to City Road, an aperture to the long, narrow chamber at the back of the gallery. The main room here has a more intimate connection to the courtyard and into the common areas of the faculty. So we proposed 3 interventions. The first was a 1-to-1 scale abstraction of one of the smallest projects exhibited, Nicholas Gurney's studio. Reduced to a simple form and uniform material, with none of the light and air actually afforded the space, it became a startling tool to communicate scale, amenity, and enclosure. Sitting slightly off-centre to the room, this structure forms a series of galleries around it. The second intervention was a model viewing apparatus, utilising the forced perspective of Borromini's Palazzo Spada. This hulking creature allowed physical scale to be distorted. Fitting snugly against the street window, it emitted a soft blue glow day and night. And right at the end, inside, the balsa models of each project were held on a small pedestal, rotated daily through the exhibition, and allowing the visitor close proximity from within. The third space was a room for sitting and listening to the videos, listening to each of the architects speak about their projects on video. We posed 5 questions to frame a description of each project, the strategies employed in the transformation, and finally a tough one. How can we, as individuals and a collective, live in a better manner. It was quite an undertaking. At the end of each 30 to 40 minute interview, we were blown away by the material recorded, how articulate our speakers were, our subjects, how accessible the projects became, the power of the human voice. And it makes us wonder whether we exploit this format enough as architects, as a way of recording and archiving our thoughts, and as a way of communicating what it is that we do. Sam Marshall, who has a wonderful history of curating architectural exhibitions and publications in Sydney, wrote a reflection for us and introduced the exhibition on the opening night. And he took snippets from the interview transcripts like this, half stream of consciousness, half kind of rap, which we found very beautiful, and he read them out. The video he made is up on YouTube, which you might like to have a watch. And the catalogue will soon be on our website as one of the books. There's a few more pictures of the opening night. We kind of knew it was a success when people were Instagramming themselves, Instagramming the show. So one of the wonderful things about the exhibition was that we didn't overanalyse or forcefully draw conclusions from the projects. We let them sit. Commonalities evident from an intent of making architecture at a certain scale. And these were some of them. Spatial thrift, material canniness, mutability of the threshold, the generosity of a garden, and candour in a manner of living. As with the early projects of many young practices, ours were defined by the need for a sense of economy. This was manifest not only in terms of budget, but also space and time. But we've also consciously made our practice so the projects we make have an affinity with the way that we want to be in the world. So for this talk, I'm going to share some of the exhibited projects, some of our own, and try to weave together snippets of each, following the framework of these shared aspirations. So the first. It was interesting to have Peter Stutchbury declare during the interviews that he's no longer taking commissions for bigger houses. We included Peter's tent house in the exhibition. He was ill on the day of the interviews, and so some weeks later we rocked up to his office on the Northern Beaches with all the gear and made the recording there. Afterwards he showed us each of the projects that he had on the drawing board at that time. A collection of exquisite houses, spatially rich but by no means cheap, but compact, just enough to accommodate one or two people and their aspiration for a way of living. So our projects. This little cottage on the left was our own house and our first collaboration together, designing and building. You almost walk through the bedroom to get into the house. These large sliding panels providing privacy on those rare moments when the uses conflict. And to the right is the stair, our benchmark now for what is just acceptable at 620mm wide. But benefiting, as the bedroom and hallway also do, from this double height space. We describe this house, 3x2, as the making of a new whole by retention of one half of a structure and the reconfiguration of another. The existing semi contained very serviceable bedrooms and a traditional lounge room at the front. And to ensure that the project could be built, we made the decision that nothing was to be duplicated from that half of the house. But also that very little would be prescribed in this room, aside from the cooking spaces, of course. And this space became the great room. Within a small footprint, at the moment where the house connects to the garden, the family can come together around the kitchen or the dining table. A toy box here doubles as a bench seat for dining facing inwards or out. At other times it gives a spot to recline. And the concrete plinth provides an arse-height perch when in conversation. Or a spot to sit and play. This project will be called one of 16, sitting here in the middle of an intact row of 16 terraces, and at the end 17th for the developer at the time. You see the pattern from behind. It's very typical. A low pitched roof on the 2-storey portion falls from the parapet towards the rear, and from here the rear wings sit back to back, each with a skillion roof falling from a common ridge. And between these, the gaps, shared spaces for access to light and air movement. So the ridge of that skillion sits below the main gutter, and the gutter level of the lower roof is also set to achieve consistency of form. These are now heritage listed inside and out. But we were able to negotiate a kind of playful stop end to the skillion form, which I'll show you later, one which better negotiates the need for privacy. But our spatial problem was the height set below this skillion roof, which was unchangeable. And so as part of our transformation, we've made a family bathroom of tiny proportions, including a ceiling of 2.1 metres, but one which can offer a real generosity. The first chamber of the bathroom is open to the hallway, borrowing that space and light. It contains a small vanity, to the left the WC and to the right the wet room. Each chamber is separated by mirrored doors sliding into a pocket. We finished this one about a year ago and have been waiting for the garden to take shape before shooting it, which we're happily doing next week with Brett Boardman. Always such a wonderful day in the project. So onto materials. This is Anthony Gill's Waterloo Terrace, which we included in the exhibition. He described a process where, over a long period of time, he and his clients wrestled with and then settled on how a manner of living in the place, which his clients already did very beautifully, might be enhanced. They didn't need more space, and so the decisions were made to ensure that the richness already enjoyed was not lost, and that maybe the house will feel like it's been there for a long time already. There's an aspiration in our work for utilising the skills and materials at hand on site, resulting at times in a rawness and an honesty, but also a process which strips back finish and reveals the hand of the maker. That's the Waterloo Terrace. In the 3x2 house, we looked to the house's history, specifically the wonderful leanness of these single-skin timber-clad walls, with the framing exposed on the inside. And then moving down that hallway and into the great room. Timber framing is exposed, holding pockets of shadow, giving height to the space and an expression of the room's making. Using kauri pine ply between to make storage and nooks for display, and a screen between the stair and the bedroom upstairs. And there are moments of this stripping back in centripetal as well, the transformation of a 3.3 metre wide terrace in Bondi, where we negotiated a series of priorities across every millimetre of that width, resulting in an arrangement of simple carpentry, studs and ply, allowing light and air to transfer between the levels at the staircase, the stair itself hanging on a single piece of ply. And the art shed, a long pavilion of two very different spaces for each of our clients, a photographer and a sculptor. You can see the aspiration in the first image for something as rudimentary as a garden shed, which had actually served as Todd's workspace until now. But also for a building which can allow Todd and Shireen to actually contemplate their work in solitude, or to share it with curators or with each other. A building which is inventive and ordinary, unfinished even. We pulled the ceiling back in Todd's sculpture studio, exposing and painting the roof beams and softening the light with translucent sheeting at the threshold to the garden. And with the sliding panels closed, that light works differently again, which is perhaps a good segue. Stephen Collier spoke so beautifully about his apartment in Horizon. how each room, even from the shower, now has a direct line of sight to the outside. This made possible through a series of sliding and pivoting panels, allowing a multitude of configurations to the layering and arrangement of that space. He also noted the importance of seeing the sky no matter where you are, always being aware of the sky, the weather, and how this acts on our mood, on making us feel happier. I tend to agree. The expansive aspect enjoyed from within a tower, though, is wholly private. The moments which I've gathered from our work relate to the sky, but also gardens, the street, public life. They relate to a manner of being able to inhabit the edge, to be close to but apart from that thing. This one's a project we're yet to publish, and we're calling it Bolt Hole, after our original brief. Our client, a good son, helping his 85-year-old mother to make a comfortable city bolt hole. Our client, also a good developer, had one eye to the executive rental market, and so decisions often had a dual purpose. But we loved that he and his mum embraced the right big move at the beginning, and this is the result. That was the result. It looks to be a fairly original sandstock cottage. It was an 80s build or rebuild over original footing. Entrance was formerly at the corner here through that archway, and the side lane was unused. A small rear courtyard was overlooked, overshadowed, and the house was poorly arranged, with the most private rooms to the house shuttered off at the front. The walls are predominantly built to the boundary. We kind of feel like we need to be better citizens than that. And we also needed to borrow the extra light and air that this street facade could afford. So with a nod to Donovan Hill's D House, though perhaps more extreme in its proximity, we moved the public functions of the house onto the street side, and we provided a series of layers which can be peeled back depending on one's mood or the weather or the time of day. A slight elevation between inside and out gives privacy, and you can choose for the life of the street to be drawn into the house or vice versa. And then you can retreat to the sky space, a courtyard in the middle, capturing northern light over the roof and the trees. This outdoor room provides a further layer of privacy to the bedrooms at the rear. And from the shower at the furthest corner, again, the sky. So, back to our little cottage in Newtown, and the little counterweighted sash window onto the street which we sat beside in the meagre light it afforded, dreaming of bigger things. We made a window, and this was it. It was 2.5 metres wide and 6 metres high. 2 of those sashes slide upwards behind the balustrade of the upper floor, and a third drops down in front. And here you see the action from within. I think we all dreamed of some moving parts on this one too, but instead we made the budget. That's what I was thinking. We made the threshold at the lower level completely operable in a variety of ways, whereas above, the views are oblique to the trees and the sky, the checker box giving privacy between neighbours and to the bedroom upstairs, while the stair, sitting back in the plan, has a more direct outlook from that lower or middle window. This is Jack at the light threshold between new and old. The breezeway ahead of us in that picture opens completely to a sunny courtyard. The concrete plinth continues the original floor level of the house and steps down to a brick-lined floor. And then looking back from within the new room, We're looking north, so this corner with the built-in sofa is a place to sit with the sun on your back, whilst looking through to the garden. Much of the threshold to the south is fixed. We made thin for a thrilling proximity to the outside. Except in the middle here in the kitchen, where tall screened doors temper that view to the garden. So standing here, your focus is directed to the room and to social interaction. And the last one. We don't have a name for this one yet. Maybe half full. It's kind of a pity that half empty gives a sour connotation, the void or the absence being so powerful in architecture. The project was a rear extension to a terrace in Glebe, just a stone's throw from the city. And the problem of extending onto the rear of a terrace is that you push that one good threshold further and further back, leaving an ever longer, darker space than perhaps you began with. So we tried to give those dark front rooms as much real estate to the outside as we could. Balancing that with the spatial requirements of a new kitchen and bathroom, we decided to share the width equal parts inside and outside. And for our tomato growing client Pete, a sunny rooftop veggie patch. At the end of the site, the garden room assumes the full width again, and with a skylight along its edge, is holding the most wonderful light at the bottom of the garden. And perhaps this project should firmly sit under spatial thrift, the kitchen and bathroom strung like this along the southern side. It's currently being built very beautifully. This is the most exciting space. 5 counterweighted windows enclosing the kitchen and bathroom slide up in front of the facade, dissolving the threshold. So there's a concrete bath at the end, which suddenly sits in the garden, and a single step down from the kitchen floor can become a play ledge for little Felix while his parents cook. And from the dining room, the stair winds its way around the back of the table to make a sunny window seat, commanding the full length of the garden. So we're looking forward to coming back to Glebe when it's a bit wild and overgrown, and we'll slip it into this category too. They're all interrelated. We were fortunate to include Neil Durbach's apartment in Small, which had never previously been documented, drawn, that is. We'd seen a few photos floating around. And he talked about how half the space of the apartment is actually garden, and the satisfaction which that decision brings. The unfixedness, the perpetual state of change of a garden as a counterpoint to that which is built. That slitheriness, he described, being a quality which he's brought inside through mirrors and glass and gloss white paint, and now aluminium paint too. So back at Jack. The garden was always going to loom large with this 116-year-old jacaranda tree, its limbs stretching from the very rear of the site and defining the line to which our transformation could extend. Our clients now perch near this window, watching the bird life which comes through the garden itself a changing riot of red poinsettia in the foreground, the deep purple tippecina off to the side, and of course, reaching over the lawn, the lilac blooms of the jacaranda itself. Or pushing back the sliding spotted gum screen, they can bathe amongst what is now a grove of ferns and ginger and bromeliad. These daily experiences enhanced through the connections enabled. This one's a project down in Caulfield, Melbourne. It's currently under construction. It's for an intergenerational family home, statistically a huge home. It's got 6 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, but then 2 kitchens, just 1 car space. The statistics start to skew. I actually had the bank's valuer call me, perplexed, just to understand what it is that we propose to build. But there's a room here with no door on it, they said. Sorry, where are all the bedrooms? And the living space is tiny. Well, it embodies so many of those themes that we pursue. Our clients were actually just about to sign on the dotted line for a project home style duplex on their site, and decided they couldn't subject their children to that upbringing. And they got in touch. And we've been able to work together to land not too far from the original cost of that project home. The basic arrangement is for one long, low family house, sort of slung down the southern side here, and the bedrooms of that home sit up top to make the requisite two-storey form to the street. And our clients' elderly parents then have ground level access and tuck in underneath here, having a more traditional front garden and rear garden kind of arrangement. And then at the back, an outdoor room. The rear garden is shared, centred on an existing elm tree and framed by the living spaces and the outdoor room. Each element has a thickened, raised threshold, a veranda which separates each household from the garden, enabling privacy whilst living together at close quarters. But the threshold also frames these low, wide vistas, bringing the garden to the fore. And from the family living space, half inside, half out. So finally, this is the Annandale house by Welsh and Major. And what a wonderful way of inhabitation they've made on this site. And such a candid process described. A series of considered actions to reveal what is just enough, though also a step beyond the mere pragmatic considerations. Our job is to be subjective, Chris stated. Again, this idea of not being overly prescriptive with use, allowing overlap of program. So to wrap up, I thought I might share a portion of our written introduction to the catalogue of small, along with a final collection of images of our work. So if the historic manner in which housing was built was individually, with each household working within the societal norms and the building tradition of the day to determine the character of their own home, the more recent manner is of different forms of speculative procurement, beginning with terraced housing, project homes, walk-up flats, and larger multi-unit dwellings, which has seen the gradual commodification of the home. This has resulted in the nature of our dwellings being tailored more closely to the ease of production and often generic ideals, rather than accommodating the way in which we would actually like to live. In contrast, we might ask, what if a hybrid tent house was so perfect for you that your house only cost $38,000? Or if you could live an exhilarating and connected life in the centre of a metropolis within 27 square metres? Or if, say, a third of the dwellings in the city doubled? Not in size, but intensity, being the number of people who might dwell within, or not simply dwell, but also work. For us, the examples in this exhibition have caused to radically revise the base unit, and so bring into question the fundamental premise of the housing market. Answers touted to date relating to supply and demand or other financial mechanisms which may have great effect in the short term seem not to go to the heart of the matter. Instead, we could seek the development of an endemic form of housing which is more finely tuned to prevalent conditions, that is compact, essential and exciting. The projects in this exhibition demonstrate specific manners in which we can live with less, which in turn has caused to allow even more of us to engage in the egalitarian ideal that is the foundation of the great Australian dream.
Scott Baumforth is the Hobart-based and founding director of Terroir Australia since 1999 and Terroir Denmark since 2010. Terroir was established in Hobart and Sydney simultaneously in 1999 by Tasmanian-born and raised directors Scott Baumforth, Richard Blythe and Gerard Reinmuth. While it is now an international practice, the heart of Terroir remains in Tasmania, and it enjoys its head office being in Hobart very much. The work of Terroir ranges from small-scale public and private architectural works and installations to significant public, institutional and strategic projects. Terroir is an architectural practice interested in the potential for architecture to open up questions of cultural consequence, with a particular focus around the nexus of culture and landscape. Scott has been responsible for a range of award-winning and internationally published strategic master planning, public, commercial, residential and interior projects. Scott is experienced in managing multidisciplinary teams and working with stakeholders and regulatory authorities. Fun, fun, fun. He has gained considerable expertise on the front end of new projects, where his architectural thinking, and this is important, where his architectural thinking has aided in the establishment of a shared vision that guides the subsequent business and technical development of their projects. Scott has achieved innovative and awarded outcomes within extremely challenging time and budget constraints, with this strategic involvement through all facets of a project. I think we'll see and hear much more about some of these projects tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Scott Baumforth.
I'll brave holding the microphone. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Brickworks. I don't know many people over in Western Australia or Perth. I know Adrian. So, Adrian, thanks for inviting all your family here tonight. So, greatly appreciated. No, thank you for your time coming out in what is always a busy time of the year, sort of getting into the year. I hope I've answered Stephen's brief quite well. I hope to give you also a range of projects. Generally, they're chronological to our practice, which, as Stephen said, is now nearly 19 years old, which is amazing. I don't feel that old. In that time, we've had some amazing people go through the practice, so I'm sure everyone would sort of testify you're only as strong as the people that are sort of sitting back in the offices at the moment. Or not at the moment, it's sort of, no, not at the moment. We have operated, as Stephen said, from Hobart and Sydney since 1999, and then sort of more recently in Denmark. We actually just classify ourselves as one office in 3 different locations. I think it's sort of telling, sort of probably coming to the only other brickwork studio that sort of probably feels as isolated as Tasmania. This was a sort of image of a book I sort of found when I was cleaning up my parents' house sort of a number of years ago, and it made me remember that once upon a time someone pointed to this and said that's where we live. Now that's technically correct, but growing up on sort of Hobart's eastern shore on the sort of left-hand side, we had a green roof. So I construed that what they were saying was that was our house, and all that sort of big stuff that was the sort of the view across the river and the sort of Mount Wellington sort of as the sort of famous backdrop to the sort of city of Hobart. Was that big stuff that sort of happened over there. So I haven't sort of yet delved into that sort of subconscious to understand what that means, but I think there's sort of a thing about scale that's always intrigued me about the sort of the detail and that monumentality. And that sort of follows in terms of sort of the landscapes. On the left, a very famous picture of Franklin River by Peter Dombrowski, the late Peter Dombrowski, an amazing photographer. And one that we've looked at sort of closely in the early years of the practice, who had the ability to sort of get this sort of amazing scale out of these landscapes, but then quite often, perhaps not so much in this image, drill into the most minute detail. Quite often sort of plants that are in the foreground of these images that you could sort of touch them and they'd still bear the imprint in sort of many years to come. But of course, we grew up in sort of funny times in Tasmania. On the right, sort of Bob Brown, the founder of the sort of Australian Green Movement, literally in 1983, the year that we were in high school, first year of high school, Tasmania was a sort of a place where, in looking back, talking about landscape in a very aggressive, in a very confrontational sense, was part of the norm. It's something we sort of understood, that sort of political connotation that landscape sort of has. The ways of sort of moving through the sort of landscape is probably indelible within our sort of way of thinking. These are very clear, of course, sort of the tracks, but it's also the way we weave around the sort of landscape in our sort of home state. So an early installation, we had sort of 7 kilometres of this builder's tape and a 2-day installation at a winery So we ran these sort of 7 kilometres in through the sort of bushes, and we thought we were sort of talking about a line in the early work. And then sort of some of our earliest sort of work, this is Peppermint Bay, which now sort of goes back nearly 15 years ago, which occupies a headland on the sort of Dontracasto Channel on the sort of right-hand side. We first started sort of just tracing this line around the site where you might arrive from the sort of bottom and move up around the sort of site, and eventually sort of come back and culminate this sort of really old oak tree that sort of was the symbolic heart of the site. And just through sort of simply drawing those sort of patterns, we sort of arrived at a sort of plan that very much changed the sort of the way the client had thought about sort of operating this place. You actually walk in and can actually walk through out in the garden, come back and find a place in either the bar or the restaurant or the sort of this function room. They can all open up. It's a bit like a sort of little Swiss Army knife, this thing. It opens up and closes down. Was completed in in 17 months for $1.9 million, everything all up this sort of building, which is about sort of 1,000 square metres. The kitchen was at the back. You walk past, you actually saw all the sort of food production, you saw the sort of people moving sort of through. But as we sort of started, we've sort of, first of all, sort of built these models, which are very much sort of placing the public on one side and the sort of back of house on the other. And it was through that sort of idea of thinking about the building, what if it was a landscape? How would we sort of build a landscape that we're familiar with? So we went through these iterations of gradually merging the building so it became this sort of singular plate, which we sort of quite often spoke about. And of course, the facade started to take on the characteristics of the landscape of which you saw when you sort of approached the building from arrival. It was a tin shed essentially, sort of, but using sort of the formal quality to sort of say something about its place in the garden. It sort of tried to sort of lay low from the sort of rear here, with the sort of the main spaces there sort of poking up sort of onto the sort of garden. And then inside, down through the central path, this sort of timber sort of threshold that sort of you walk through into the sort of the restaurant sort of space looking out onto Dontracasto Channel, and then ultimately into this sort of function room, which sort of here seen in winter, but sort of really sort of lined up with the sort of this oak tree on the outside. And there it is sort of an evening, sort of the 3 spaces sort of opening out. Not long after, we sort of had this project in Burnie, which is about 4 hours drive sort of northwest of Tasmania. A really tough area. It's sort of a real sort of industrial city, and coming to terms with sort of the loss of a paper making sort of industry that had really sustained the town for many years. This was sort of part creative industry coming out of the paper factory, part sort of museum for the sort of town. The usual brief, it occupied a headland out on the sort of the end of the sort of main street of town, overlooking Bass Strait. The brief came to us as this. I think they actually imagined, we'll just want a box out there, and people will come in here, and we'll pay them, we'll charge them to come in the door, and then we'll charge them to go in the gallery, and then we'll sort of charge them to make paper making and things like that. And whilst we didn't sort of immediately jump to it, we started thinking that actually what this was, you know, it's not our saying, it's sort of a living room for the town. And it was important that this town of sort of 20,000 people had a place to go. It was more than just a visitor centre. It was a place that sort of people would be proud of that they had in their own sort of backyard. So what we did was strategically put this sort of red bit in the middle. And probably they didn't know at the time, we actually gave it 3 ways of getting in. So we thought if you ever want to charge to get into here, it's actually going to cost you a lot of money to service 3 different entries from sort of the different approaches that the building occupied. Luckily they haven't sort of done that. And then off in the sort of wings, we took these activities, and rather than being sort of specific functions, we grouped them into sort of different organisations. So there's sort of a cafe off in one area, there's sort of a retail sort of and studio area in the other, a sort of multi-use space, and a sort of paper making facility down there. And so this sort of red bit in the middle became this sort of space that to us was the most important space of the project. And ever since, we've sort of found ourselves, probably not deliberately, but always finding this sort of in-between space. It's not really sort of part of the city or the sort of civicness of the sort of projects. It's not really part of the sort of the functional use. It's this sort of in-between space. That's it sort of in the middle, where sort of looking out with sort of the radial arms and sort of out to Bass Strait. A couple of years ago, we sort of had the good fortune of and hard work of setting up in Denmark. Out of that's become a sort of a number of projects. This was a project completed a couple of years ago. It was for the World Maritime University, which the city of Malmo sort of went and hunted and sort of grabbed them here. It's basically a finishing school for sort of ship's captains who go there and sort of driving the big superliners and tankers around the world. they spend a sort of period of time here. The building is, there's Tornhuset, which is an old tower house, sort of strategically located halfway between the old town and the harbour. Strangely enough, when we sort of arrived there, the thing that we saw was actually something we were very familiar with from Elizabeth Street in North Hobart, just probably sort of 300 metres up the road. And this is this sort of way the street just bent a little bit. It's very subtle, and it's like Elizabeth Street, which is a sort of a Hobart sort of prime street coming from the waterfront, sort of heading up out of the sort of city. It just sort of wafts and weaves around the landscape. And so when we did a fish cafe in sort of the top end of Elizabeth Street a number of years ago, we used that sort of oblique and sort of these glancing views to sort of place this frame within the sort of front of the fish cafe on the ground floor that actually opened up sort of more diagonal and very acute views up and down the street. So when we sort of came to this project was done in collaboration with Kim Utzon Architects. Kim's of course the son of Bjorn. And the success of this project was actually, the story goes that when Bjorn Utzon sort of was successful in the Sydney Opera House, one of the things he did was buy a summer house up on the sort of Swedish coast. So that meant Kim, growing up, actually learned how to speak Swedish very well. And so for a Dane sort of working in Sweden, that was incredibly valuable. So what it meant was sort of, Kim was able to sort of arrive at these meetings and sort of talk very sort of, probably sort of elegantly and sort of quietly to sort of the Swedes. Meanwhile, Gerard, who was sort of on this project, was running around like a bull in a china shop. He could almost do anything because he had Sir Kim very much sort of appeasing the sort of the clients of the sort of time. So the project was really to sort of complete this sort of this L-shaped building with this new building that sort of glanced the sort of the journey from the sort of the old town out to the sort of harbour, and sort of provide a stack of spaces that all the way up from sort of the inside with the sort of lecture theatre that they just sort of rain off by sort of a big curtain that they bring around. Up, it was sort of in a way having a sort of tango with the back of this old building, and in a way brought to life the sort of space between. So similar as the Makers Workshop project before, we actually say the most important space in this building is this in-between space, the sort of space between the old and the new, and popping out and sort of engaging. And as you sort of go up, you've got the sort of little meeting rooms that sort of peer back over to the old building as sort of, and bring to life that old building that had never been realised in this sort of way. And then eventually when you're up in the sort of roof, you really are running around in the sort of top of this building. And for those that know sort of building in Sweden, it's an incredibly rational place to build, pretty much governed by about 6 or 7 main construction firms. So to be able to sort of get away with something like this was, I think, a real challenge for us sort of, to do so. And then so eventually when you're up, the sort of the new and the old start peeling away. So you're actually running around within the sort of the envelope of the sort of the old building. Seen here sort of at the top. And as you sort of move down the sort of side street and sort of get this glancing view, it sort of pokes out if you've got the sort of front-on view to the sort of old tower house. And as you sort of move around, the building just sort of opens up a little bit like the sort of the original sort of inspiration, which was probably the lens of that sort of project in North Hobart back in home. This project was actually completed before that one. It's a youth housing, it's sort of like student housing. There's 56 student apartments in this block, and it really was incredibly cheap. One of the first buildings down on the sort of a very large area of Aarhus, which has been sort of the port activity has been moved further out and undergoing sort of significant development. This had to really sort of exist in its sort of presence before all those other buildings came along. It sort of was a pretty tough little sort of cheap building sitting out there. The brief was the sort of top bit and the bottom bit. So basically we knew that there was going to be a lot of sort of students and a lot of sort of people eventually hanging around sort of this new part of Aarhus. And also it was a series of sort of individual apartments. But what again sort of interested us was these in-between bits. The sort of chance encounters, so we sort of literally turned the sort of central stair into a sort of a public space. We brought the sort of inside in, we sort of carved out a bit of the base. Students sort of can come in, and every sort of level is just slightly shifted, so you get these overlapping views all the way around. The colour, so you can tell by the sort of colour, it's got the nickname the volcano within sort of Aarhus. And then at various levels, this being sort of halfway up the building, it breaks out into a double height space, and actually off that is the laundry. So these sort of secondary spaces that are very public within a sort of student housing took a prime spot. And actually the way they sort of operate, sort of the morning space here with the sort of sun, this one gets the afternoon sort of sun as the sun tracks around, of course sort of maximising as much sun in a place like Aarhus. And then of an evening, the students sort of gather up within the envelope of the building. It's sort of, it is Aarhus, it's not Perth, where they can sort of gather within the sort of the envelope of the building, but sort of still be outside overlooking the sort of harbour. And you can see here we're one of sort of these sort of 4 buildings that sort of popped up, pretty much the first on the sort of the entire sort of harbour front, undergoing sort of redevelopment. I think the research that we did in that placed us in really good stead for this project, which was a major project by the University of Tasmania. Our office is 60 metres up the road, so it was a site that we'd walked past for nearly 15 years at the start of this. And it was a dead part of the city, only about 4 blocks sort of north of the GPO. But it was a sort of major initiative of the University of Tasmania to put 430 student housing or student houses within the sort of centre of the city. They're also undergoing sort of major works in sort of different parts of the city to really make Hobart into a sort of more active, really sort of student-orientated city. The site had a 9-metre drop from the sort of top down to the bottom, had a sort of series of heritage listed buildings here. That was part of our site, but the site was essentially a big car park. And in Hobart, quite often you have the luxury of sort of underdevelopment meant most sort of spaces were just bitumened over, used as car parks, a very popular Sunday market. So there's incredible archaeology when we sort of pulled it up. There's also a sort of pattern of use that we were able to tap into of people walking down through here, very much a shortcut to sort of the city of Hobart from the northern suburbs coming down. We were given a feasibility sketch plan, I think it was, which is the sort of dotted thing in behind here. And this project was done in collaboration with Fender Katzledes, incredible team to work with for their generosity and their support to us as principal consultants to the university. We were the first Tasmanian practice to be able to sort of take on the role of principal consultant with the University of Tasmania of a project of this scale. And we just sort of looked at it and saw there's actually a very simple way we can sort of run the buildings in sort of an orthogonal manner to Brisbane Street and Melville Street. Elizabeth Street's the one that sort of slices through on the topography, therefore it's sort of at this skew. By placing them here, we sort of provide this sort of really nice north-facing or northeast-facing courtyard, and then sort of turn these buildings around to get the sort of mountain view. So there's a few very simple steps. We break the sort of one big student accommodation building into 4 towers that are all interlinked. There's 3 front doors, you can access it from any of the streets, all sort of interlinked. And it was all part of that idea of actually just sort of weaving this building back into the sort of city. You see that sort of shifted geometry. So this is Elizabeth Street, the old buildings on Elizabeth Street sit there. To the left of me is a sort of fairly important church within Hobart that sort of is a very much a landmark coming out of the mall, coming up the hill. So the building sort of peels back and actually sits quite sort of politely, I think, within the sort of the smaller scale sort of urban context that it's been inserted in. But again, what was really important to us were these in-between spaces, and this is some of the early diagrams of saying the student spaces, the accommodation spaces are pretty much set. They're a sort of set size. But we were fortunate enough to really convince the university to go for this nested series and scales of spaces, whether it was these little breakout spaces. We didn't have balconies, of course. They become a sort of an OH or a liability and a risk to student housing. But we convinced them to have these 1.6 metre wide gaps. They're gaps between sort of apartments, randomly spaced. That means that if you've got this apartment with an amazing view over the city, you can just sort of come out without it really engaging with the rest of the world and sit here in the sort of sun overlooking that courtyard. So every student had this sort of immediate sort of amenity of this outdoor space. The corner communal rooms were sort of, they're more communal rooms than most student apartment complexes, I think, became these sort of next step up. And then spaces around lifts and laundries and things like that also became these sort of very public spaces for the students. So when we sort of started stripping back the bit that the university was interested in, which is the student housing accommodation units, and sort of started mapping that, we had these sort of quite interesting diagrams of sort of hierarchical spaces. I mentioned before, Hobart sort of is a city which has an incredible topography, and growing up, there was this sense of you sort of met someone in sort of a particular location, you'd probably go a different way every time you went there, or if sort of 2 people left, they'd probably go different ways. And quite often you're walking through buildings and down streets and sort of cross a laneway. It's just a way you move around a city with quite a sort of rich and diverse topography. And now sort of 25 years ago when I was sort of travelling overseas, or 20 odd years ago when I was travelling overseas, James Sterling Stuttgart Gallery sort of really struck accord with me on the way that sort of that just welcomed the people coming in from the top of the town through the centre of the museum and then out through the sort of front. And it just probably something that stuck in my mind for a long time. So this was a chance that we could sort of recover something like that and retain the way that people used to walk through the building. So 24/7 the public can still move through from the top of Brisbane Street to Melville Street, or more often down into Elizabeth Street as sort of a shortcut. Fully compliant, disabled access, sort of better than the street actually, sort of as a sort of compliance. This is the space within, very tough, of course, being a sort of a pretty tough budget, but sort of this pathway down from Brisbane Street down through the middle, and then just pouring out the sort of the car parks and opening out the sort of the car park sort of subterranean level to the sort of student and public spaces that are sort of centred within this core. And then down on the sort of street, it sort of brings its scale down. It sort of references or tips its hat to the old heritage sort of scale of the street. Reinstates a sort of a very big awning and sort of really creates a space down on the corner of the street. And a very much a generosity of the university in having this sort of student space, which is not yet sort of fully up and running, but will really sort of draw the sort of activity of Elizabeth Street into sort of the building. At the same time, I was saying to Anita before, we really probably can't say no. So strangely enough, we're also doing $220,000 public toilets for the Hobart City Council. This one is a sort of a small project in Princes Park on the headland, which you see in this sort of old photo of Hobart, a really early sort of painting of Hobart. Very much sort of a history steeped in sort of being a fortress, a sort of a gun sort of placement for sort of defending the harbour, not that they were ever called into sort of being. Pretty much a throwback. You can see sort of we were doing it in concrete, what we were doing with tin at Peppermint Bay. Of literally sort of we got ourselves in a tangle on this project, and sort of we're trying to do this sort of complex. And I just turned around to sort of the young student that was working closely with me, and I said, just imagine we sort of just bring that wall that bounds the park in and lift it up and sort of tuck the toilets in there, which is very much what we're doing at Peppermint Bay, just conceptually lifting the ground up and sort of tucking all the functions in. And so we had sort of great fun with this, as sort of this concrete block. Yes, the kids do hop up onto it, but that's okay because there's a big pirate ship park just immediately behind the photographer here. But it's very much about privacy with these sort of tubular screens, which are sort of double-sided, so you've got the ventilation through without the sort of the visual, whilst maintaining visual privacy. But very much about that oblique view where sort of the passers-by come very close to these new toilets. And so we sort of provided the sort of that sort of shifted view again, in this sort of way of almost dealing with projects in a very choreography, or with a strong sort of choreography of understanding how people are placed in relation to sort of the project. But then you can see the sort of 3 toilet facilities just opening up like that. We have good fun with sort of little projects. This one was a project that we were involved 3 times, I think, to do with the nature of the project. We were initially involved a small council on the Murray River, somewhat sandwiched between Echuca and Swan Hill, at a place called Kundra. And they wanted a wharf, because they had a wharf previously and they wanted a new wharf. What the brief was literally a sort of wharf that was about sort of 10 metres by 20 and just looked like the old wharf. We actually worked with them, and this was an early idea of breaking it down. They actually wanted a reference to the past. They wanted something that meant that they could sort of pull up in their kayaks and canoes and get out, and sort of it's quite a sort of strong river level fluctuation here. And they actually wanted to be able to use it in a modern way with sort of modern watercraft, but also sort of bring back some of the old paddle steamers that originated here. We're then engaged to sort of take the Regional Development Victoria really liked this project. They got behind it and they pushed it through, and we then had to sort of tender and go through the process again. We were fortunate enough to get the detailed design, and at that stage we used this diagram and sort of said, okay, what we'll now do is sort of unpack those elements and place them in a manner to the landscape that they need to be. And this is sort of an early sketch. That's sort of how it originated. The old sort of turntable, which is pretty much ends the axis of the main street in town, shifts people around. A large space here that's sized that it can hold a 10 by 20 marquee, which they do have on occasions now. And a space that sort of weaves in, provides a very functional gangway to a sort of a platform that rises and lowers, and provides another sort of space, the wharf part, which sort of orientates back to the heritage component up and down the river. So you see it here just sort of wandering through, had great fun sort of on this project, great client, a fantastic community who were really behind it. fantastic story with the Murray River red gums when we were originally talking to the sawmill, which is about 120 metres along the river and provides this constant sort of grinding within the backdrop to the town on a daily basis. We spoke to the manager and he said, I'll be able to get this timber pretty close. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. So we went through a process, they tendered, they won the contracts 9 months before the bridge was tendered itself. They cut the timber down. I went to him on the opening day of the wharf and I said, how far away did you get the timber? And I thought he was going to get it from sort of about 40, 50 kilometres way up into New South Wales. They got it from within a 4 kilometre radius, the timber. It was moved to 120 metres away on the site and brought to sort of site and erected. So there's a fantastic sustainability story, I think, in that sort of for the client. Here you can see the sort of stepping stones down. The river level really does fluctuate. Quite often it'll come up to the top step, so we had to deal with that. And sort of moving down sort of to the river. People, what's really nice, this has come out. This is actually the way the boats used to round up in the river, come up and sort of come up against the tide. So we placed one of these viewing platforms back against the goods shed, which is just on the right in the sort of the old wharf location. And then the sort of the Murray River looking sort of upstream and the sort of impact of the river on the sort of the balustrade there, and a sort of another one looking down the stream. And actually sort of a really nice moment was when the client went home one night, sort of not long after completion, shot through a photo of a local family that just put a picnic table on this very scent and had their sort of dinner out there, which I think is a great thing for community projects. That's a sort of map of probably the sort of projects we've done throughout regional Victoria in the last 5, nearly 6 years. You can see we're sort of circling around. We hope to land a few things in the sort of big smoke sooner or later. But it's just been an iterative process from one to another to another. The most recent one, this is relatively new. Just before Christmas, we were fortunate enough to win a competition for a discovery centre in the Puffing Billy Railway. Those that sort of know, Puffing Billy is sort of a really an iconic Victorian sort of tourism thing. An old sort of heritage steam railway sort of through the Dandenongs. It's actually on the back of a master plan that a lot of people were getting on a Belgrave that's completely sort of saturated in terms of its development. It can't expand anymore. Most were getting off at Menzies Creek because they do the sort of the big bridge sort of here and then sort of disappearing on sort of quite often bus trips, going through incredible growth, this tourism venture in terms of international visitation. What they want to do is put this new discovery centre at Lakeside, which is really halfway between their overall track. Only 10% of people who'd go on Puffing Billy ever use this sort of second half of the track. So they're just trying to use this place in the middle to both provide a new end station but also a centre station that people would then sort of move in different directions. The master plan identified a new discovery centre that was shifted along from the old station. They kept the station intact and sort of positioned this, and it overlooks Emerald Lake, which is a really nice sort of lake, part of the Cardinia Shire Council. We started by sort of drawing that back to them and said, well, do you really want this? Where sort of people arrive here and wonder what's there and are they here or is it there? So we thought about the most consistent thing of these stations is the platform. The buildings have come and go. Most of the buildings are recreations of a 1920s style that they've used as a style guide all throughout Puffing Billy Railway. But it's the platform, that sort of horizontal datum that's become sort of constant for over 100 years. So we thought, first of all, what we'll do is look at that platform and extend the idea of the platform around as a way of linking the old and the new. And then we sort of started thinking how that platform could weave amongst the trees. It's an amazing sight. It's literally the edge of the Great Dividing Range with this sort of native forest behind you coming down into sort of outer metropolitan Melbourne and then looking over this sort of former nursery site down below. So this idea of this building almost sort of weave between starting off at small scale and sort of coming into big scale, and constantly sort of pushing people back out to the experience, which is really the hero of the site, which is the Puffing Billy. And then sort of moving through this sort of quiet building sitting in the sort of the bush, how the sort of frame might start making references to the old sort of trestle bridges that sort of are prevalent through there. People sort of constantly being pushed out to this sort of view outside. But Interps is going to be a big story, and we sort of looked at both the sort of the botanical qualities of these sort of old sort of drawings, and then the sort of similar style or similar time, the sort of the great age of the sort of steam railway, and how these drawings sort of had a sort of commonality, and this idea of almost sort of uniting the stories of the sort of the park in which we're going to be situated and the trains in a sort of a shared manner through this. So we're working with Thylacine, who are interpretive company we've worked with many occasions. On the left is the work of Janet Lawrence, a Sydney artist, who sort of again gets into that sort of intense botanical sort of detail. And then this sort of example on the right that we showed them of this sort of exploded vehicle and starting a very early concept idea of how the visitor might sort of discover the stories behind sort of the people that have used the sort of railways in the park through these sort of commonality with sort of this small detail. But to finish with, and I think I'm okay on time, one of our largest projects, a project that's actually just started on site and it'll finish at the end of next year, is the Penguin Parade Visitor Centre on sort of Phillip Island. Phillip Island's about sort of an hour and a half out of Melbourne on a good run. It's actually sort of a site that's a large percentage of Phillip Island is actually managed by Phillip Island Nature Parks, who are sort of a government agency that invest all the money that they get from sort of things like the Penguin Parade here, which you can see is by far and away their number one attraction. All of that's invested back into conservation and research, and they've done some incredible work over many decades. They've of course got other sort of the Koala Sanctuary and sort of Seal Rocks and Churchill Island is another sort of one of Victoria's earliest sort of farmhouses. But it's the sort of Penguin Parade, which is of now, it's actually well and truly beyond 700,000 people per annum go to see the penguins. What that means is any night there's in between 1,800 is a small night. The maximum capacity is just under 4,000 people. And what's incredible is 37% of the international interstate visitors come to Victoria specifically to the Penguin Parade. So they're coming to see the Penguin Parade, then they realise, oh, well, we're also going to Victoria then. What that means, not only is that an incredible number in terms of its importance economically, and I must stress every bit of dollar goes back into this conservation and research, but there's an incredible expectation for the people that are coming here. Now, most of them wouldn't realise they're going to be sitting on concrete bleachers waiting for the penguins to pop out with up to 4,000 other people. It's horrific when there are that many people visiting the site. 100 years ago, people used to sort of wander down. The Penguin Parade has been a phenomenon for over 100 years. People would come down, just sit on the beach. And in a way, our project is part of a bigger project of how to give nearly 4,000 people per night that intense experience of almost that intimacy with the penguins. It's a big challenge. The Penguin Parade was actually in decline. These figures here show that before 2000, they would have had no penguins on this part of Phillip Island, which would have been a catastrophe. The Kerner government back in the mid-1980s made a commitment. They actually bought back an entire suburb. There was over 180 houses, a hotel, golf course, a shop, and a lot of dogs and a lot of other cats and things that were decimating the penguin population. I think it's the largest government buyback for a single species in the world. And then you can see the sort of the increase in survival of the sort of penguins through that sort of graph. This was it in 1985. You can actually still, this is a modern day aerial photo, but the sort of green represents the penguin colony clinging to the edges of the Summerland Peninsula at the western end of Phillip Island. You can see the traces of the subdivision still there, and now sort of with a lot of work to sort of grow over. At the moment, this is the penguin colony, so it's grown incredibly. The Penguin Parade Visitor Centre sits down here. The attraction is really down on the beach. There's sort of the old concrete bleachers and the new Penguin Plus facility by Woodmarsh. And then our project now is going that next stage. We're actually going to be redoing some of those sort of beach facilities. But the sort of big part of our project was giving back nearly 7 hectares of new penguin habitat. And this was the important thing. They had to move the existing Penguin Parade Visitor Centre back away to really sort of form this key avenue for the penguins to ensure their continued survival and flourishment. This was a master plan concept that was done. The responsibility is that the author of this was last year's gold medalist. No, the year before. The year that we got the project was Peter Elliott. So we sort of, there's a bit of pressure when you sort of rock up and start saying, look, we like this, the principles behind it, but we think you could change it a little bit. And meanwhile, Peter's there probably with the weight of the gold medal hanging around his neck, and the client very much sort of aware of what are you trying to do to us. So, but it was a really good collaborative process. The client engaged Peter. He became like a sort of a peer review and a mentor to the process throughout. The concept, though, the thing that troubled us is most people will arrive by bus or car. That's just the phenomena of how you arrive here. It's really a 2-hour event. There's going to be people through the day, but the major Penguin Parade arrival is a 2-hour event just before and just after dusk. A massive car park. People are going to arrive in this large plaza and almost walk into a building that really much sort of spread itself across and said, here we are, we've arrived, we're going to sort of fleece you with a bit of food and drink and fluffy penguin to take home. And then you're going to go out the back and then sort of move down. And so one of the big things we sort of started talking to them about is you've got this 700 metre roughly journey from the moment you arrive to the moment you hit the sort of penguin viewing. What happens if your building was just about 100 metres of that? And so it was a long process to eventually turn the building effectively around 90 degrees, and the building just becomes part of that sort of built journey in very much the early days of Peppermint Bay, just building up the sort of the choreography through the site. So there's a sort of an elevated sort of render of the sort of building sitting back. The current building sort of is pretty much up here. We've moved back, and how visitors will move down these pathways to the penguin visitor experience and then sort of arrival and then move back through the building. The building physically sits at the intersection of these 3 unique landscapes. The dune has no penguins really in it. It's a majority of short-tailed shearwaters, which are a pretty significant migratory bird. The bluff is where the penguins come in and sort of will find their nest, and then a sort of pretty significant wetland. So the building really sits as a brooch, and that was part of the master plan placement. So the idea is that the building, as sort of this form has developed, really sits as a brooch between those landscapes and reaches out in a similar but slightly different way depending on each of those 3 landscapes. The view on arrival is very much about this sort of slightly mysterious, what is it? You know, what am I moving through? Building compared to sort of the departure when the building really sort of sinks and into the sort of darkness and really becomes this sort of beacon in the undercroft. A lot of work gone into bird strike and sort of keeping the Cape Barren geese from sort of off the glass and things like that. There's a lot of sort of natural habitat to sort of be dealt with in this sort of project. And whilst we'd never sort of stand up and admit we sort of were going to design a building that looked like a penguin, there was just this subliminal stuff. When we sort of started working on the project, we were looking at these, this is interesting, sort of, yeah. And we sort of stumbled upon things like that, and that's interesting. We didn't really know what we were doing with it then, but it gradually re-entered the project, so you could see, like a penguin has this sort of dark fur on the top and sort of the light underneath. The building actually in the zinc cladding is going to do the reverse. It's actually got a lighter sort of top, and then as it comes down, the zinc will sort of change into these sort of pixelated patterns, sort of really to increase that sort of idea of wrapping the building up underneath. A triangular pattern sort of on the outside and patterning in through the interior starts picking up on this sort of triangulated detail of the penguin fur in a slightly oblique manner, but again, just part of the way we operate, so quite intuitive on those types of things. The movement from sort of inside to outside, you can see here from the front door, you still see through to your eventual destination down on the sort of headland. The inside is pretty much that sort of central space with sort of a series of spaces around the outside, which are all part of the sort of brief and operate at different times. The new habitat is actually going to be brought right up against the building and the restaurant, and they'll sort of get a continued use out of the restaurant, where currently they only get it when sort of visitors first arrive. It's been mapped to do a number of different functions. There is the day visitor who will come here and orientate themselves within the Summerland Peninsula, but also some pretty major pedestrian movements of an evening going down, actually going out. The half hour after the sort of penguins arrive is probably the biggest use of that sort of central space. But it's really this sort of space around the outside, that bit between the main walkway and the functions that sort of sit off as sort of arms projecting into the landscape, which is probably where the most development went into. It's sort of spaces to sit, spaces to hang around, spaces to sort of be these thresholds, which is a common theme out of Anita's work, into these spaces. And it was really, again, another space we introduced into the brief. It was sort of quite a defined brief. We were able to sort of just massage some of these spaces to create this third space. Here is sort of an early concept model of upturning the building. And then sort of finally, on arrival, you walk through, you see the sort of hint of these sort of threshold spaces on the side as sort of the faceted timber building, which is all part of the sort of integral structure, these concrete columns which the sort of timber building drapes over, and then sort of come down, and sort of eventually people will be able to sit up there and say hello to a penguin that sort of waddled up and tapped at the window. So That's us.
Fantastic presentations, very different approaches, both visually and verbally, but that's kind of what we like. We like to have contrasts, but while it might seem contrasting, there's a lot of overlap in the way that architects work, the way that architects think. One of the particularities of that is the analysis and reinterpretation of a brief. Both of you talked about that in different ways, but both of you find that to be extremely important, as many of us do. Perhaps could you both comment a little more about how important that is to your work?
So the question was analysis.
Analysis and
Brief,
reinterpretation of a
yeah.
brief. You're given something,
Yeah.
and you analyze
Yeah.
it, and
Yeah.
you think about it, as we do as architects, and through our filters, we can think of other ways of
Yeah.
doing what these people have asked you to do.
Yeah. I mean, I guess our briefs are perhaps a lot simpler than dealing
worry
with
about that.
penguin habitat.
Don't worry about that.
No, but so in some ways people think less about them. You know, there's not been so much time lavished on exactly what that brief is. And so in some senses it's that direct personal conversation about extracting how to turn something generic into something quite specific. How we quite often with a family or a residential kind of situation talk about rituals, because every family has different rituals, and whilst you might know the number of spaces that you need, or how many spare rooms, or that kind of quantitative thing, we don't often stop to think about the things we automatically do or desire to do, and how we might make a space for them.
So you create a briefing process through discussion to tease out these things without necessarily them giving you a physical brief or a specific brief.
Some people like writing, some people like talking, so we're very flexible in terms of how we receive that. We received our first video brief last week, which was a great tool. I mean, we all kind of do it with our phones, and so that was just a quick walk around. We weren't there, just recording thoughts as they happen in a space. So it's kind of
Okay, well, I'll come back to some of those points, but Scott?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. It's probably, we find a lot of briefs are actually quite light in their detail, and the decisions that we sort of make is actually in a way to work with the client to sort of get back before the brief. And I think that's where sort of a lot of our work tends to sort of focus in terms of, what is their political ambition of the project? And quite often when you're working with someone like the University of Tasmania, you actually find out well into the project that so they made a decision to take on a more challenging site than what they could have. And that's because they had this sort of inkling, and I think sort of, a lot of clients have that inkling, they can't translate into a brief. And quite often then it's when they sort of freeze on a brief and all you're reading is a schedule of areas or sort of maybe an overarching ambition statement. But the brief for that one was very simple. It was sort of to really open the university back up in a very open and literal sense, because education in sort of Tasmania was really, the number of young kids that were going through to higher education was criminal. It was horrendous. And the last Vice-Chancellor just wanted to make a change on that. So gradually you've got to sort of get back to understand you're actually doing this building to be a very public, visible statement for the university, but it's got to be a building that opens itself out. And we've been fortunate enough to work with some architects from the mainland on some really interesting projects and buildings in Hobart for the University of Tasmania before that one. But they probably didn't have the Vice-Chancellor guiding with that rigour. And so I think a lot of what we're trying to do is sort of search for what's the driver and the motivating factor behind the brief, and how can we do something that actually sits within the sort of limits of the brief but gives them something more than they expected. That'd be okay. And that's those sort of in between, those third spaces.
So you create some kind of dialogue to try and tease these things out, that they trust you, that they might reveal more about what their thinking is without really knowing that. Yeah. Getting back to what you said, Anita, about clients, I think it's extremely apparent that you get very close with your clients. you have a very strong relationship with them, and you've been able to provide projects that are tailored to suit these people, as you stated, but in a very generous way and a very uplifting way. And I think that's your intent. But could you enlighten us a little more about how you work with them? You just talked a little bit about that, so you preempted my question about how you discuss these things, how you tease out the ritual, how you provide for the things that they do that they didn't think were important but are. Can you describe a little more about your relationship with those clients? And then there was that one that's down in Victoria, where they were going to get a project home but then decided not to, and then the relationship you created with them was very important to create that building.
Yeah. So there's probably a few answers there. I think sometimes we don't know what we want until we see that we don't have it. And so I think in presenting clients who are not necessarily informed in thinking in drawings and spaces, and to put a drawing in front of them might be the first time they realise, suddenly there's nowhere for those rituals to take place. Or and so I think the brief is often quite a simple conversation at the beginning. I think our most articulate client told us that she was currently living in a Meadow Lee container, and she would rather that be more like a cheese grater. And that was the house where we've got the skinny garden and all the windows lift up, and I think that maybe that's a cheese grater. Like, it's kind of it's doing the trick. But from that conversation, I think we go away and think about what the place needs to be, what condition there is that we found. We draw it, and I think that's an important part of discovering what that might be. And then we come back with those first thoughts, which are well reasoned, and negotiate from there. I think from there it's a constant.
Yeah, so the dialogue goes through drawing as well. And
yeah,
that's an
absolutely.
important aspect
Absolutely.
of that. Yes.
Yeah. So we just let that settle for as long as it takes, and just continue working it through. And we commit to all our clients, just so that they understand that we'll both keep working until we're both really happy with that result.
I think that's a very important part, isn't it?
Yeah. So sorry, just on the Melbourne clients, I think we had to build trust. There was a process which they had a very finite solution for a finite amount of money, and so we went through a much more careful process to actually establish whether they were making the right decision. So we don't always seek costing advice until much later, because it's costs as much as a percentage of the house, for some of those projects. But it's kind of perhaps more intuitive and
it's not usually cost effective to do that when you've got such small budgets.
Yes. But we did embark on this, and we used those numbers to really hone the size of the spaces that they were getting, and size was the most important kind of tool to achieve what they needed.
And how did they find you, given the distance? Well, if you want to reveal things, I don't want to.
So, I actually don't know whether I want to. There was a particular saying which I won't repeat, but a friend of ours worked in the film industry for a particular director, and suggested that we were quite good at polishing a dime, whatever. And so they had this incredibly suburban sort of very early 80s house in a cul-de-sac in Altona, which we helped them with. And then they're friends with these clients, so it's sort of one thing led to another. But yeah, it's our reputation.
On a similar theme to do with job sourcing, and for someone that actually started in Hobart and grew out of Hobart, and you're still there and operating in many other locations, I'm very interested for all the work you're doing in Victoria, and you don't have an office in Victoria, but you're based in Sydney and Hobart. Step back a bit. what was it that led you to move from Hobart to Sydney for a start? And then the Copenhagen thing is probably more socially related than it is otherwise. But I'm fascinated by the winning of all the work in Victoria these days, and be fascinated to understand.
Yeah. We're not that complicated. We generally have made decisions that are both professional and just suit us personally, pretty much. So the Sydney thing was, Gerard and I grew up, we're in the same university degree for the first 3 years. We split. I stayed in Hobart, Gerard went to Sydney. He established a network. Richard was sort of tutoring us through that. There was this sort of, Gerard was keeping contact with Richard. So when we started, we sort of had this crazy idea, and we're the first practice to start. Bob had a very significant practice in sort of Tasmanian architectural history. And from that practice, there'd been really very few practices that had started up in Hobart. So when we started in 1999, I think we were only the second practice in probably over a decade that had actually started. So it was a strange thing to start up a practice in Hobart. We just had this crazy idea of, let's have a sense that we might have an importance of our home site or our home city, but we want to be part of a bigger discussion, and that was the Sydney thing. And Gerard had established a lot of good connections up there, so it was pretty much established simultaneously. At the time, Gerard was working overseas with Richard Murphy Architects. Gerard had been talking to John MacDonald, who was sort of an art critic, and I think it wrote a sort of a response to one of his pieces that established a connection. John was then sort of engaged by the owners of the Queen Victoria building in Sydney, who was a Malaysian company. They wanted to sort of do a contemporary art gallery in the top of the Queen Victoria building, and that was our first project, essentially. It was unbuilt, unfortunately, but that sort of gave enough impetus to say, let's do a funny thing and start a practice. So it very much came out of personal circumstances, and then the sort of Copenhagen thing was the same through Gerard. So the Victorian one, actually Carl Fender, we credit with sort of talking to Gerard and I a number of years ago and saying, look, at those times Hobart was a bit of a basket case in terms of work. Sydney was tough and still is tough, and I've sort of spoke to Anita about that, and Anita sort of gave some sort of hint into sort of that actually there's a new energy coming out in the younger practices in Sydney, which is sort of good to see and good to hear. But Carl basically said sort of, look, get over to Melbourne, start doing a bit over here. Now, we didn't directly take that, but just by chance we were sort of put in an EOI. We did a project out at Glenrowan for a Ned Kelly Centre out there, which was sort of a feasibility study, and then one thing led to another, and it's really just been a good hunting ground. And whether we set up an office there or don't, that's sort of probably the thing in the ether. No. There's just a nice connection. I think now we can sort of come in and do what we do and sort of come out, and I think there's an importance about that travelling and that distance for the work.
Anita, can you talk about the influence of studying in Belgium and who it was that might have influenced you during that time that brought about a lot of the sensitivities in the scale and the detail of your work? And secondly, do you work with industry very closely, or do you impose your own will on industry in terms of the detail of your outcomes?
Going to Belgium was more about travel, I think, than a particular personality or the school. It was kind of a tough transition because it was an engineering architecture course, fourth year, mathematics and concrete structures and things in Flemish. So we did a bit of travelling, which was as great a teacher and something which we continue to do a lot of. And I think that answers your question. That's probably our biggest. Why Belgium? There was a partnership established with Newcastle Uni. So, yeah. So we went on exchange for that period. Industry. It's an interesting question because I guess in some senses we use industrial products as finish. I don't think that's willful, or is that? So, oh, you mean work?
No, I think Bob's referring more to how you work with your builders and contractors to achieve what you achieve. Is
Okay.
that what you're asking?
Okay.
It's not industry
Okay.
as such.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but when you refer to industry, you're not saying industry. You're talking about the actual makers of the building.
Yes. Yeah.
Go through to actually kind of realise the detail that you
Yeah.
envisage.
Yeah. We draw everything, which is not unusual, I know, but that's kind of the first step, so that you're in a position on site to be able to justify what you're asking, because it's drawn and considered, and it's not sort of a fanciful thing or something. Like, everything has a reason, I think. So,
And are you able to get them on side so that you learn how they do things and they learn how you do things?
absolutely.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
that's what you're getting at. Yeah.
Okay.
But how
You can
difficult
answer.
is that? I don't know the answer. I'm teasing out the answer. But you mentioned during lunch you had some builders you've worked with more often and some that
Yeah.
have fallen by the wayside. How difficult or easy has it been to work with some of your contractors to create the work that you create?
Yeah. I think it no matter how good the contractor, it's difficult, because you've kind of got to always be ahead and in conversation to be able to talk about things before they happen. And so that's kind of our main mechanism, is being on site a lot, to talk about it, talk it through, talk about expectations. Concrete's just, the hardest thing, isn't it, to define expectation. And
Especially for clients.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So communication, I guess, and persuasion in many forms, just to be able to kind of sometimes, go that step further, but mostly complete the contracted task.
And is your detailing coming out of you, or is it a combination of you and the people you've worked with and for to be that interested in that level of detail?
I guess we both worked for very detailed oriented people, and whether that's something that's learnt or whether it's something that you're attracted to, I guess at the same
A bit of
time, it's
both.
kind of,
Yeah.
if you seek that interest, and so we're definitely continuing that.
Okay, slightly different note. Scott, architects doing public projects or private buildings that might be public, search for public space within a private brief, and you do that a fair bit in your work. Talk a little bit more about the importance of that and the negotiation of trying to create that. You touched upon it with the housing in Hobart, but it's an important factor in a lot of your work. Even Peppermint Bay, you touched on it.
Yep.
It's an important factor for all of us that do those kind of projects, that we search for things that give back to the public realm in something that's more of a private project.
Yeah. It's probably something that when we first started the practice, we were very fortunate enough to be building houses as one of our first projects. Houses on the sides of hills overlooking sort of the Derwent River, which immediately puts you out of the domestic scale into the public scale. You had to engage with the public realm. I won't embarrass Bob by saying we then, looking back at sort of projects that had done that in sort of generations before us, and it was some of Bob's projects that sort of grabbed hold of landscape in a very strong manner in a very small house, and houses dealing with incredibly tight budgets. So you had to engage with a bigger idea in a very sort of particular way. So I think it's just been a natural way we've sort of migrated that into sort of when we're doing either public projects or private projects with a public nature. I think the other thing is invariably coming from a base of building in sort of Tasmania, and particularly buildings had to be, clients would always say, oh, we've got to be flexible. And what they're actually saying is they didn't really trust their anticipation of what the user was going to be, and they wanted to hedge their bets. And so again, rather than being sort of something was overtly flexible, we just tried to sort of open up opportunities for other audiences or a publicness that they probably could see that it would draw more people to a project or open up an audience in a particular way. So I think it's actually just the early DNA of the office, and then that's sort of become the way we've tended to see projects through that lens, I suspect.
I just have to remind you of a small project that you did in Hobart for the conversion of the Hutchins School into a small kind of hotel service department.
Hotel, yeah.
And being on the national jury with a bunch of rogues, we visited that and were most impressed with the kind of
You weren't impressed enough to give us an award, Bob.
I'm getting there. There was a
This is still a sore point.
There was a moment when it was a mixed bag of characters on the jury, and there's definitely going to be a commendation at least. And as Gerard would always say, you know how bloody hard it is in Tasmania, no budget, and we're working the crap out of this thing. But a moment in time when John Mainwaring came down the stair, ripped his favourite jacket on the handrail detail, that was the end of the award.
Don't blame us. That project was incredibly derivative of Carlo Scarpa. So
Stephen Hull meets Scarpa.
Yeah, Stephen Hull meets Scarpa. But that was a great project where it was our first ever project, the built project. And I remember dealing with a client who was pretty naive. It was a Masonic club, and they had like a sort of, it was like, I don't know whether it's the same over here, but RACV hotel sort of club that members would pay us a really reduced rate to stay at this sort of boutique hotel. And every room was different. It was sort of in a heritage building, and some had lofts, and some were actually bunk rooms and things like that. But great joy in sort of understanding that, yep, we could sort of get a bit of lamy panel and cut it this way and get a $2 soap dish, one of those moulded ceramic soap dishes, and put that in the middle. And it was just a great fun project to sort of play with. We said to the client, what are you going to do for beds? They said, oh, we'll just go down to Harvey Norman and buy some beds. No, you won't. And so we sort of drew them up a bed, and it was all out of MDF and sort of steel, and it cost us a national accommodation. But no, it was a good fun project. Unfortunately, it's been demolished. They gutted it, yeah.
But there's both of the work is very much committed to a common approach, detail, in terms of the quality of your own view. Can I just ask Scott for a moment, there seems to be a very common thread through all the projects that are emerging, even through Copenhagen back to a very angular kind of characteristic, which you seem to work with the opportunity and manipulate it into a kind of a consistent formal approach. Is that a conscious kind of process or not?
It's probably becoming more conscious because it becomes a natural go-to in times of dilemma, and we don't immediately jump to there, but it becomes a way of understanding, yeah, this is where we do things that we feel comfortable, and I think it's part of, we don't feel as though we've practiced as 19 years old, we feel as though we missed about 6 or 7 years in there, so we probably feel
There's been some tough times.
You know, there were some tough times. It literally was that, and everyone around here would know about that. But I think when you're sort of young, you're sort of searching for these ideas, and you're of course sort of trying to find how you operate. And I think that's something that we take great interest in, is not only how we operate, but listening to other architects and understanding that they are different, and what drives them is sort of completely different to what drives you. And I think a lot of it comes down to the techniques we use are quite often something that we could build a cardboard model of, and that was, we did a lot of cardboard modelling early, even to the point where when we started getting some better computer technology in the office, we're quite often telling the operator, can you just build it like a cardboard model? And of course that cardboard carries particular characteristics that has that geometry that I think we're most comfortable with. And I think that's just sort of something that's sort of operating through the practice. It's got that DNA, and we'll quite often revert back to cardboard models. Even Gerard and I ourselves, in a moment of dilemma on a project, we'll quite often just take a bit of cardboard and a cutting board and a knife home, and it's good therapy as much as anything.
actually, following on from that, the way I see part of that is the evolution of your discussion about the line, and which I might reinterpret as the trace of your idea or journey of a site around a building, which has manifested itself now into a more angular form. And through that visitor centre project where they gave you the square thing, you turned that into something else, which then ended up having this kind of angulated space in the middle. And that now seems to be evolving as a thought process through the work. And that's, I agree that there's been this evolution, and you're probably still thinking and refining as you go along of how that line through the landscape, the one that you did with the tape, is still informing the work, because that has turned up again as your balustrade detail on that wharf project. Yeah, so it's still there, and I think it's conscious, even though you might think it's unconscious. You probably do play with those, because we all build languages, and we try to explore, how do I use this time? How do I push this idea further this time? And these things are coming through in different ways, given the typology or the brief or the budget of later projects.
Yeah, definitely. And I, one Anita mentioned sort of a minute ago about a client coming talking about a cheese grater, and it's remarkable the number of times we'll talk about inanimate objects as generators. We did a house once where Jared and I would talk to each other, and a lot of the early practice was done about talking. We would write or talk, sometimes sketch, sometimes fax each other backwards and forwards, whether he was in sort of Scotland or more particularly when he was in Sydney. And we'd actually talk a project into reality, and quite often it was, I remember we did one project where it was sort of, imagine if you were standing on that particular Cholita sculpture and this sort of lid came on like a brooch that Richard used to have sort of as part of his daily attire, and it was just these inanimate. One was sort of a sandwich press, the sort of things that you press down and put a knife through, and it's very hard, of course, when you get sort of then start employing people and they come in and you're talking about what a sandwich press, and then they try and replicate that, and it's sort of, it's a very hard thing, and everyone around here would know, either sort of coming up through offices or working in offices, of how you get away from that trick of being just a caricature of yourself. And I think we did our masters through RMIT, same time as Adrian here, and before us was Timothy Hill and Brian Donovan. I remember their master's sort of presentation was basically them realising they got to a point where they could design themselves out of a paper bag easy. They had this armoury of sort of tricks that they could get out, and what they were trying to do in their practice was search for something that meant that they didn't then spend the next 20 years just working over caricatures in a larger office which could sort of handle the style. There's actually something more, I think, that was driving them than just sort of ending up sort of like that. So it's I think when you package up a presentation like this, you tend to sort of delve into what is that DNA behind you, but quite often I think there's also other things which we've probably got.
Anita, quick question.
Okay.
The scale that you're working at the moment is creating some of the most beautiful work in Sydney today. Do you have aspirations to grow in scale of work, and if so, are you kind of pursuing the competitive process opportunities that can provide that, or are you waiting it to happen naturally, or how can I help?
The answer is yes, you can. We were actually talking at lunch about luck as well, and whether.
Yeah,
which is
Anita
kind of what
has
you're
already been doing some of that, but we'll happily chat to you about it afterwards.
But
The collaborative process that's required today
yeah,
will create the opportunity for you to take the lead.
Yes. So it was interesting as well putting this together. I took a presentation where we'd been up to Newcastle and we were talking about context and the development that's happening there, and so we borrowed from quite a few things that we've done that made us look much larger. But I sort of took them all out tonight because it was a different focus and a different structure. But we have been, I think the Emerging Architect Prize is a really wonderful way to, I guess, put a kind of title over maybe where you're at, or I don't know. Like it certainly we've picked up a lot of attention from the government architects and from the City of Sydney, who really foster emerging architects in their design excellence processes, and so we're certainly engaging in some of those things. I shall. So we've been seeking collaborations. We did a competition with Cox last year, which was an interesting. They're certainly also seeking collaborations. I think there's kind of a really wonderful dialogue, particularly with the Sydney office there, in seeking out various things, but also collaborations for small things. We just sort of came up in conversation with Aaron Peters up in Brisbane for the NGV Summer Architecture Commission, which we did together through conversation as well, and just always returning a sketch, and then the conversation returns, and so it was something that we're testing in different sort of ways. But we also were invited to take part in a fine-grain urban design study for the government architects along the metro line. Yeah, we sat around and took feedback and had a discussion with Olivia Hyde afterwards, just about the exact nature of what our task was, because obviously there's so much work that's going into the process from so many different departments and many years of reporting and things, and they really brought a bunch of fairly inexperienced practices to come in that field, to come in and provide a review and a suggestion and a way that perhaps there might be gaps in that process. But it was so much fun to do that, and I think we understood our job to be approaching with naivety, perhaps the task, to see new things, which was quite good.
Okay. I feel like we've only touched on some things, but time has run out. I have to wrap up now. Please join me in thanking our guests for their wonderful presentations. On behalf of Brickworks, I thank you all for coming again to the first Brickworks Double Talk for this year in Perth. As it turns out, in 1 month's time exactly, on the 8th of March, we have our first international speaker coming to Perth. Kevin Carmody of Carmody Grog from London. That's going to be very special. Please come along. Get on the mailing list if you're not already there. So we'll see you again then. Please, we have time before we take these people to dinner. We have time for you to come, engage with them one-on-one. It's a valuable thing that Brickworks allows, so you've got time to come and talk to these people. If you're a bit shy about asking a question, you can come and do it privately. We've got time, come and do that afterwards. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. So thank them again, please. And have another drink before you go. Thank you. Good night.